Okay, so building off of what we just discussed, and after watching our video on mutually assured destruction, I would like for you to take a minute or two to discuss this question with a neighbor. It says, a vice is squeezing the world between the two superpowers' weapons. So you've got Russian bombs over here, the Soviet bombs, and then the US bombs over here. And here's that vice crushing the world in between them. What does this cartoon have to say about efforts to build up nuclear arms? Discuss that. Have an answer for me in about a minute. Ready, set, go. All right. So I would say when we're looking at this cartoon, it is stating that when these two nations built up their nuclear arms in this race, it was really putting the rest of the world in a little bit of trouble. They're getting squeezed together between these two as their two intentions and their two policies are really only putting the world in danger, right? Because if one were to use those nuclear bombs, mutually assured destruction would say they would use all of their nuclear weapons on one another, and it would lead most likely to a world that was uninhabitable by the human race. So, when we talk about some of the influences within the US government that kind of instill these Cold War policies, one can't forget that in 1954, the Secretary of State under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man named John Foster Dole, introduced the policy to him called massive retaliation, which goes hand in hand with mutually assured destruction. What massive retaliation is that if you have nuclear weapons, as long as you are threatening to use them, you don't even have to actually use them, but as long as you threaten and are willing to use them in order to exert overwhelming force over your enemy, this would deter any threats by the Soviet Union or the communists. This is kind of like pushing the bear. This is really saying that if you threaten to use nuclear bombs, mutually assured destruction will hopefully keep the other side from acting. Um, and of course, American government officials would threaten this time and time again. But what they probably should have been a little bit more thoughtful and foresight was that the Soviet Union would do the same. Dulles also would push through his massive retaliation policy under Eisenhower's administration, the idea of brinkmanship, the idea that if you go to the edge of war, if you get close enough to the point where you are willing to use those atomic bombs, it would continue to deter the aggression of the Soviet Union and vice versa. Um, More or less the idea is if you're playing a game of chicken, you got two people driving two cars right at each other. The person that pulls away the first to save themselves is kind of the loser. But in this case, Dulles says that if we get to the edge of war, if we continue to threaten the use of atomic bombs, and if we get to the point in which we would just narrowly use them, it would show faults. It would lead to the Soviet Union stepping down and pretty much answering the way we wanted them to, doing what we wished for them to do. Um, he gave this famous quote that a lot of people kind of associate with brinkmanship. He said, "You have to take some chances for peace, just as you must take some chances in war." So he's saying here is like, if we use these nuclear weapons in a way that threatens an end of a world, as you want to call it, with mutually assured destruction, that it does create some form of peace. Now, obviously, not everybody's going to see it that way, and all it would take was, one person that would actually use these weapons to break all of this and see the system completely collapse. Luckily for us, that did not happen. Eisenhower would adopt many of Dulles' policies, including massive retaliation as well as brinkmanship, in his approach to dealing with the new threat of nuclear weapons being in the hands of the Soviets. But with this, he would a lot of times actually advocate for covert responses as well. He was well aware that threatening the use of nuclear weapons wouldn't answer all the problems. And what he ended up doing instead was he would um, operate privately through a organization within the United States government called the CIA. And the way he would do so is he would send covert operatives to foreign nations and more or less train them and provide them with support in their fight against various communist movements that a lot of times are being supported by the Soviet Union. This was true in Europe as well as Asia, but probably under Eisenhower moving forward, probably the most important region for him when it came to fighting communism through covert operations with the CIA would be Latin America. Latin America, of course, being directly south of the United States, he saw this as kind of like our backyard, and he considered, making sure that communism did not spread into these countries through supporting regimes that countered communism as the best way to protect our doormat. During his presidency, you would see operations, particularly in Guatemala. That was one of the big ones. But obviously, there were others as well, including intervening at one point in Cuba, thanks to the Platt Amendment, Paraguay as well, and then several others. But this would actually continue all the way into the modern day. As early as 2019, you would see CIA operatives operating to fight communist regimes in countries like Venezuela. So this was a policy that even in many cases preceded Eisenhower, but using American intervention through covert operations in Latin America became a norm for administrators in the United States government all the way into the modern day. Another policy that he will adopt from the previous president, Harry S. Truman, was the policy of containment. And this is what I mean when I'm saying like using CIA operations to stop the spread of communism. He was primarily pushed to this through the idea of the domino theory, another theory that is associated with many of these Cold War policies we've already discussed, suggesting that if even one country were to fall to communism, it would lead to those neighboring countries of that nation to maybe follow. The best example of this was China. When China fell to communism, slowly but surely ended up in Korea. In a later time, we would see that in Vietnam as well as Laos and Cambodia. But what about Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Burma, India, all these countries that bordered nations like China? The idea is that by allowing China to fall to communism as well as Korea and Vietnam, that this would just continue in this region and it would continue to spread. During his administration, yes, they focused quite a bit on Latin America, but also the Middle East. Starting with Turkey under Harry S. Truman's administration, there was fears that it could possibly start to spread into some of its neighboring nations because many of them had already bordered the USSR, the Soviet Union already, like Iran, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. They were very fearful that communism could spread, according to the domino theory, into these regions as well, so covert operations were installed under Eisenhower's administration too. So before we talk about our last little discussion topic for the day, I would like for you to take a look at this graphic really quickly with a partner and discuss this question. How does this data shown in the infographic illustrate Eisenhower's approach to defense spending? I want you to think about what is he focusing on, what is he prioritizing compared to maybe what he is kind of overlooking. So take a few moments, discuss that with a neighbor. We'll have an answer in about a minute. Well, if you can't already tell, when it comes to Eisenhower's administration, most of the defense spending, excuse me, was used on nuclear warheads. During his administration, we started to heavily focus funding in our military on developing nuclear warheads. And one thing that we started to lessen the amount of defense spending on was actually actively deployed soldiers. Covert operations, of course, was an exception to that, but overall, the focus was more on hey, if we have bombs, we can deter any conflicts instead of if we have men, we can fight conflicts. So, again, the biggest way he felt to containing communism, yeah, I mean, you have to have some covert operations to be able to deny your involvement in many of these regimes that are trying to fight communism. But the biggest way that he fought communism was just by building up our nuclear weaponry arsenal, using the idea of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction to deter Soviet aggression. And in a sense, this worked for a time. It kept the Soviets busy. And yeah, a lot of our public funding and tax dollars went into it. But overall, I mean, we wouldn't see a nuclear event or the threats of a nuclear event during Eisenhower's administration. Now, you're going to find out in a future lesson that that will change when the next administration comes into office, a guy named John F. Kennedy. But that, is far away in the future, according to Eisenhower. He feels that this is the best way to deter communist aggression and the spread of communism overall. Of course, he would have his critics, as all presidents do. Many conservatives, a part of his own party, argue that he was weakening our defenses by lessening our standing army and focusing more on nuclear weapons, while as many liberals feared that by increasing nuclear arsenals on our side and their side, it was always increasing the likelihood of a nuclear conflict breaking out. But right, with that idea of brinkmanship, we were always on the brink. There was always a chance that a nuclear war could break out, but it also could be used as a power to stop some type of conflict escalating, like what happened in World War II. So you can see from this graph alone, believe it or not, President Eisenhower created the largest nuclear arsenal out of any president, even into the modern day, increasing it exponentially. And very quickly after he leaves office, that will drop off steadily until the later parts of the Vietnam conflict. But that is, again, a story for a future lesson. So the last question I'm going to have you discuss with a neighbor today before having some time to work on a couple of different things is this right here. How was Eisenhower's approach to foreign affairs different from that of Truman's? What was the big difference there? Are there big differences? Were there some things that they both adopted? Have an answer for me in about a minute or so. Ready, set, go. So the biggest difference when we talk about Eisenhower and Truman um, would definitely be the adoption of massive retaliation. Truman didn't have to worry about the Soviet Union having access to nuclear weapons. It completely changed the game. And Eisenhower's response, it had to be one of escalation. If he did not continue to, in his eyes, build up our defenses, not in an army, but through nuclear weaponry, then that would leave us vulnerable. It would lead us vulnerable to Soviet aggression and influence. If we didn't make a level playing field in his eyes, there was always the threat that the Soviets could escalate things in their own favor. And as a result, Eisenhower completely embraced that idea of building up a nuclear arsenal, using it to keep the Soviets at bay, and on the side, using covert operations to subdue the rise of communist regimes in foreign nations that he saw as vital. Okay, so that's the end of our lesson today. Please do not forget that your Chapter 8 vocabulary is due today and that you have a quiz coming up tomorrow. I have also unlocked the conflict profile activity for yesterday's lesson on the Korean War. We will go over that on Thursday, and you'll have some time to work on it today or tomorrow. But something else, I also have a Kahoot for you to play with the substitute today in preparation for that quiz. If you guys end up finishing early, then I would focus on that conflict profile in the Korean War and getting started on that. Okay? All right. Well, I hope everybody has a great day.